I never thought a wooden door could make my stomach drop. But that's exactly what happened the moment I pulled into my driveway that afternoon. I live at the far edge of an HOA neighborhood, the last house before the trees start swallowing the road. Most people think that's peaceful, quiet, safe. What they don't realize is that being on the edge makes you visible. It makes you a target, especially when the HOA president decides you don't belong. My root cellar sits behind my house, half buried into the hill. Old stone walls, heavy wooden door. It was built decades before the HOA even existed. My grandfather used it, my father used it, and now somehow it had become Karen's personal obsession. From the first week she took over as HOA president, she wouldn't stop asking about it. She called it unsafe. She called it a violation. She called it an unapproved structure. I called it private property. Every time she demanded an inspection, I said no, calmly, politely, legally. She didn't like that. That afternoon, I wasn't even supposed to be home yet. I'd left work early because something felt off all day. No reason, just one of those feelings you ignore until you shouldn't have. When I parked, everything looked normal. Too normal. No noise, no movement, just wind through the trees and the low hum of the power lines. I grabbed my keys, walked around the side of the house, and that's when I saw it. The cellar door wasn't flush. It was open, not wide, just enough that the latch wasn't seated the way it always was. I stood there staring at it, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I knew that door. I locked it every time. That latch made a specific sound when it caught. It hadn't made that sound today. My first thought wasn't anger, it was confusion. My second thought was much worse. I stepped closer, every footstep suddenly loud in my ears. The air around the cellar felt colder, heavier. I put my hand on the door and felt vibrations, movement. Someone was down there. I didn't call out. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was home yet. I leaned in, listening, and that's when I heard a voice echo up from underground. A woman's voice, sharp, annoyed, complaining. She was talking about mold, about documentation, about how people think they can hide things. My chest tightened. I knew that voice. Karen. The HOA president was inside my root cellar. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. 100 thoughts raced through my head. How did she get the door open? Who let her do this? How long had she been in there? Then the voice stopped. For a moment there was silence. And then she said my name. Not shouted, not panicked, calm, confident, like she still thought she was in charge. That's when I knew she'd realized something was wrong. She'd heard my truck. She knew I was standing right above her. I stepped directly over the opening and looked down into the cellar. The dim light barely reached the bottom, but I could see her now. Karen, standing on my ladder, one hand on the rung, the other holding a clipboard like it was some kind of shield. She looked up at me and smiled, not embarrassed, not guilty, smug. She started talking immediately. HOA authority, emergency inspection, community safety. The same words she'd used every other time she tried to push me around. But this time was different. This time she was standing inside my property. And this time she didn't have permission. As she took a step up the ladder toward me, still talking, still confident, I realized something important. She thought she was in control. She had no idea how wrong she was. And as her foot hit the next rung, I reached down, grabbed the door handle, and made a decision that would change everything that came after. I didn't slam the door. That's the part people always expect, but it didn't happen like that. I just lowered it. Slowly, calmly, like I was closing a fridge instead of sealing the HOA president inside my property. Karen was halfway up the ladder when she realized what I was doing. Her smile vanished first, then her confidence. She reached up instinctively, like she could stop the weight of that door with one hand. She couldn't. The door shut with a heavy thud and the latch clicked into place. That sound echoed louder than her voice ever had. For a second there was nothing, no yelling, no movement, just silence. Then the pounding started. She screamed my name like I'd committed a crime. She demanded I open the door immediately. She threatened fines, lawsuits, liens, emergency board votes. The same empty weapons she'd waved at every homeowner who ever told her no. I didn't answer right away. My hands were shaking, but my mind felt clear in a way it hadn't before. For the first time since Karen became HOA president, she wasn't standing on my lawn or leaning into my face or hiding behind paperwork. She was trapped. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed the police. As the phone rang, Karen's voice changed. The anger cracked and something else came through. Fear. She asked me to open the door so we could talk this out. She promised to forget the inspection. She said this didn't need to become a big deal. I smiled to myself. It already was. When the dispatcher answered, I told them my address and said someone had broken into my property and was currently inside my root cellar. I didn't say Karen's name at first. I just described what happened. Broken lock, unauthorized entry, trespassing. Karen heard every word. She started screaming again, telling me I was lying, telling the dispatcher I was unstable, that I was detaining her illegally. She said she had HOA authority and that she was performing an official inspection. That's when I put the phone on speaker. I asked her calmly to explain how HOA authority worked inside a locked structure on private land. She didn't answer that. She just kept yelling. The dispatcher asked if the person inside had permission to be there. I said no. Clear, simple, no hesitation. Karen laughed. A sharp, nervous laugh. She said she didn't need permission. She said she'd been inside plenty of homeowners' properties before and no one had ever made a big deal out of it. The dispatcher stopped me mid-sentence and asked me to repeat that. So I did. I repeated Karen's words slowly, carefully, making sure they were heard. Karen went quiet. You could almost hear her realizing what she'd just admitted. She switched tactics again. She started crying. Not quietly. Loud, dramatic sobs echoing up through the cellar. She said she felt unsafe. She said I was holding her hostage. I leaned down and spoke through the door. I told her she could leave as soon as the police arrived. I wasn't stopping her from leaving. I was stopping her from trespassing. That made her angrier than anything else. She kicked the ladder. She rattled the door. She threatened to have my utilities shut off. She threatened to sue me into bankruptcy. Every threat sounded weaker than the last. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way and instructed me not to open the door. I agreed. I stayed right there, sitting on the cellar steps, listening to Karen pace below me. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The noises down, there didn't sound like one person. There were pauses where Karen wasn't talking, but movement continued. Soft footsteps, something being shifted, paper rustling. I asked her if she was alone. She didn't answer. I asked again, louder. She snapped back that it didn't matter, and that I should be more concerned about my non-compliant storage. My stomach dropped. I leaned closer to the door and listened carefully. I heard another breath, not hers, another presence. Someone else was down there with her. I told the dispatcher I believed there was more than one trespasser inside my cellar. The dispatcher acknowledged it and told me to stay put. Karen finally yelled that I was overreacting, and that this would all go away if I just opened the door. But by then, I understood something important. Karen hadn't broken into my cellar on impulse. She hadn't come alone. And she hadn't come just to look. Whatever she was doing down there was important enough for her to risk getting caught. Important enough to bring someone with her. As police sirens began to grow louder in the distance, Karen stopped yelling altogether. That silence was worse than the screaming, because I knew whatever came next was going to change more than just my relationship with the HOA. The screaming didn't come back right away. Instead, there was whispering. I stayed seated on the cellar steps, phone still in my hand, dispatcher quietly listening on the other end. My heart was beating slower now, heavier, like it was settling into something it couldn't undo. I stared at the wooden door, waiting for it to explode with noise again. It didn't. Corinne's voice came up through the cellar soft and sharp at the same time. She wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to someone else. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. She was angry, not scared, not apologetic, angry that the plan had gone wrong. She said my name again, but this time it wasn't loud. It was cold. She told me I was making a huge mistake and that I didn't understand what I was messing with. She said this could still be fixed if I stopped acting emotional. I laughed under my breath, emotional, coming from the woman packing in circles beneath my feet. The dispatcher asked me what was happening. I told her there were at least 2 people inside the cellar and that they appeared to be searching through stored items. I could hear boxes being moved now, metal scraping stone, paper sliding across wood. I asked Corinne what she was looking for. She ignored me. I asked again, louder, my voice echoing down into the cellar. I told her she was digging herself deeper every second she stayed down there. That's when she snapped. She screamed that she was trying to protect the community, that I was hiding things that could hurt property values, that if I'd just cooperated months ago, none of this would be happening. Then she said it, the sentence that made everything fall into place. She said she needed to make sure certain documents never made it into the wrong hands. The dispatcher went quiet. I went cold. I asked her to repeat that. She refused. The whispering resumed, faster now, panicked. Whoever was with her was moving more urgently. I leaned closer to the door and asked who else was down there. Corinne finally admitted it was another board member. She said they were authorized. She said they had approval. Approval from who, I asked. She didn't answer. I reminded her that authorization doesn't matter when you're trespassing. I reminded her that every sound she was making was being recorded. She cursed at me. She cursed at the dispatcher. She cursed at the situation. That's when the second voice spoke up. It was quieter, nervous. A man. He told Corinne they needed to stop. He said the cops were coming and that this wasn't worth it. He said they should leave things where they were. Corinne exploded at him. She told him to keep looking. She said they were too close to quit now. I felt my stomach twist. I asked the dispatcher if officers had an ETA. She said they were less than 5 minutes out. She told me again not to open the door under any circumstances. Corinne heard that and started bargaining. She said she'd resign. She said she'd leave me alone forever. She said she'd call the whole thing off if I just let them out before the police arrived. I told her no. The anger came back full force. She accused me of setting her up. She accused me of entrapment. She said I'd planned this to make her look bad. I almost told her the truth, that I hadn't planned anything, that I'd just come home early and caught her red-handed. But then I heard the sound that changed everything. A sharp metallic click. It came from beneath the door, followed by a quick hiss of breath. I recognized it immediately, a bolt cutter snapping shut. I told the dispatcher what I heard. The dispatcher's tone shifted. She asked me if there were weapons involved. I said I didn't know, but I knew tools were. Corinne started yelling at the man again, telling him to hurry up. She said they were running out of time. She said if they could just find the right box, this would all be worth it. I realized then that Corinne hadn't come to inspect. She'd come to erase something. The sirens were loud now, close enough that Corinne heard them too. She went silent again, and for the first time since this started, I heard fear in her voice. She asked me to promise I wouldn't tell anyone what she'd said. I didn't answer. I stood up from the steps and waited, staring at the door as red and blue light began to flicker across the trees. Because whatever she was trying to destroy down there, the police were about to find it first. By the time the first police car pulled into my driveway, my hands were steady again. That surprised me. I should have been shaking. I should have been panicking. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle in, like my body had already accepted that whatever was about to happen couldn't be undone. The flashing lights cut through the trees, red and blue reflecting off the cellar door like a warning. Corinne heard them too. She let out a sharp breath and started talking fast, tripping over her words. She told me the officers didn't need to know everything. She said misunderstandings happen all the time. She said this could still be handled internally. I didn't respond. An officer stepped out of the car and asked who called. I raised my hand and walked toward him, keeping the cellar door behind me in sight. I explained that 2 people had broken into my property and were currently inside a locked structure without permission. Karen started yelling again the moment she heard his voice. She screamed that I was lying. She screamed that I'd trapped her illegally. She screamed that she was the HOA president and that this was an abuse of power. The officer listened without reacting. Then he asked a simple question. "Why are you inside his cellar?" There was a pause, a long one. Karen said they were inspecting for safety hazards. The officer asked if they had written permission or a warrant. She said HOA authority should be enough. The officer didn't even look impressed. He asked me to open the door. Before I did, I warned him that I believed they'd been moving items and possibly using tools. He nodded and signaled to his partner. When I unlatched the door and lifted it open, the smell hit first. Damp earth, old wood, dust that had been stirred up recently. Karen came up the ladder fast, her face tight, eyes darting around. The man followed behind her, avoiding eye contact. Neither of them looked like people who'd just been inspecting for mold. The officer asked them to step away from the entrance. Karen tried to keep talking, but her words were tumbling over each other now. She pointed at me, accused me of hiding things, accused me of being hostile. The officer didn't respond. He looked past her. Down inside the cellar, things weren't where they were supposed to be. Boxes were open, papers were scattered. A wooden crate had been dragged halfway across the floor. A pair of bolt cutters sat on the stone ground like they'd been dropped in a hurry. The officer asked whose tools those were. No one answered. The man finally said they were for maintenance. That didn't help. Karen tried to step back toward the ladder, but the officer stopped her. He asked her again why they were searching through stored documents instead of checking structural safety. She snapped that the documents were relevant. She said they needed to be reviewed. She said it was within the HOA's rights. That's when I told the officer what those documents were. I explained that the cellar stored original property surveys, old deeds, and boundary records tied to my land. Records that clearly showed the HOA line stopped well short of my property. Karen's face changed when I said that. Not anger, not denial. Panic. The officer looked back into the cellar and asked if anything had been removed. I said I wasn't sure yet, but I knew things had been disturbed. Karen suddenly spoke up and said everything was exactly how they found it. The officer didn't even look at her. He asked the man to empty his pockets. Out came gloves, a small flashlight, folded papers that weren't his. When the officer unfolded them, I recognized them immediately. Copies of survey maps I hadn't authorized anyone to touch. Karen started shouting again, saying he didn't know what he was doing. She said those papers were public information. She said they were allowed to make copies. The officer asked where they got them. Silence. The man finally said Karen told him to grab anything that looked relevant. He said she told him the HOA needed it before things got complicated. Karen turned on him instantly. She told him to shut up. She told him he was making things worse. The officer stepped between them. That was the moment Karen realized she'd lost control of the situation. Completely. She tried one last tactic. She said she felt unsafe. She said she needed medical attention. She said this stress was causing her chest pain. The officer called her bluff calmly and asked if she needed an ambulance. She backed down immediately. As they were being separated and questioned, I looked down into my cellar again. The place felt violated, familiar but wrong, like someone had gone through your house while you slept. The officer told me they were going to document everything and asked if I wanted to press charges for trespassing. I didn't answer right away. Because standing there, watching Karen argue with a uniform she couldn't bully, I knew this wasn't just about today. This was about what she'd already done. and what the investigation was about to uncover next. The police didn't leave that night. Not after what they found. One officer stayed with Karen and the other board member while the second went down into my cellar with a flashlight and a camera. I stood at the top of the ladder, watching shadows move along the stone walls I'd known my entire life. That cellar had always felt solid, permanent. Now it felt exposed. The officer started photographing everything that had been disturbed. Open boxes, shifted crates, footprints in the dust that weren't mine. When he reached the back corner, he stopped and called the other officer over. They both crouched down near a stack of folders I kept sealed in a weatherproof container. The container was open. Karen saw that and lunged forward without thinking. An officer stopped her with one arm. She started shouting again. She said those documents were irrelevant. She said I was exaggerating. She said I was trying to make her look corrupt. No one answered her. The officer pulled out the folders one by one, laying them flat on an old workbench. I recognized every label. Original surveys, county records, handwritten notes from decades ago showing where the land lines were first drawn. The officer asked me to explain what he was looking at. I told him the truth, that years ago when the HOA was expanding, Karen had started pushing the idea that my property should be partially included. She claimed the records were unclear. She claimed there were discrepancies. I told him I'd refuse to hand these documents over because once they left my possession, I didn't trust they'd ever come back unchanged. Karen interrupted, saying that wasn't fair. The officer told her to stop talking. One of the documents caught his attention. A map with a handwritten note in the margin, signed by a county surveyor, clearly stating that the HOA boundary stopped more than 50 feet short of my land. The officer looked at Karen and asked if she'd seen this before. She hesitated for just a second too long. She said she'd heard of it. She said she wasn't sure if it was accurate. The officer asked why she'd brought bolt cutters. Karen didn't answer. The second board member finally did. He said Karen told him the container might be locked. He said she told him they needed to be prepared. He said she said it was now or never. Those three words hung in the air. Now or never. The officer asked what she meant by that. The man swallowed hard and said Karen believed that if these records ever made it into a legal review, the HOA would lose a lot of land. Land that had already been promised to developers. That's when everything clicked. This wasn't about my cellar. It wasn't about safety or violations or inspections. It was about control. About expanding the HOA footprint and pretending the lines had always been drawn that way. Karen denied it instantly. She said the man was lying to save himself. She said I'd manipulated the situation. The officer calmly reminded her that she'd already been recorded admitting she'd entered other homeowners' properties without permission. Her face drained of color. They separated them fully then. One officer took Karen to the patrol car. The other walked the man down the driveway. He didn't resist. He looked relieved, like he was glad it was finally over. Before they left, the officer asked me if I wanted to formally submit the documents for investigation. I said yes. I watched as they carefully sealed the folders into evidence bags. Watching them leave my hands felt strange, like handing over something fragile and hoping it came back whole. The officer told me this could take time, that if what the documents suggested was true, it wouldn't stop with trespassing charges. It could involve fraud, abuse of authority, possibly more. Karen shouted from the back of the patrol car that I was ruining the community, that I was selfish, that none of this would have happened if I'd just cooperated. I didn't respond. As the cars pulled away, the night felt too quiet. The cellar stood open behind me, ladder still down, light still shining into a space that suddenly felt much larger than it had an hour earlier. I went down alone and began putting things back where they belonged. Every scrape of wood against stone echoed louder than usual. When I closed the container and sealed it properly this time, my hands shook. Not from fear, from realization. Because if Karen was desperate enough to break into my cellar with tools and backup, then I wasn't the only homeowner she'd crossed. And whatever investigation was coming, next wasn't going to stay buried for long. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. Not loud, not chaotic, quiet in a way that made the air feel heavier. Curtains stayed closed longer than usual, cars idled in driveways, people watched without waving. By noon, my phone started ringing. First, it was a neighbor 2 houses down. He asked if the police had really been at my place the night before. Then another call, then another, different voices, same question, same nervous tone. Word spreads fast in HOA neighborhoods, especially when it involves flashing lights and the HOA president being escorted into a patrol car. By afternoon, the HOA email blast went out. It was short, carefully worded. It said Karen was temporarily unavailable and that all board business was suspended until further notice. No explanation, no apology, just silence where authority used to be. That silence didn't last. The calls started coming from people I'd never spoken to before. Homeowners asking questions they'd clearly been holding in for years. Had Karen ever entered my property before? Had she ever demanded documents? Had she ever threatened me with fines I didn't understand? I answered honestly, and the more I answered, the more the pattern became clear. She'd been doing this for a long time. One neighbor said she'd come into his backyard while he was at work. Another said she'd opened his shed to check compliance. A woman down the street told me Karen had insisted on seeing inside her garage because she suspected unauthorized storage. No warrants, no permission, just confidence and intimidation. By evening, a group chat formed without the HOA's involvement. Dozens of homeowners comparing stories, dates, threats. Someone posted screenshots of emails where Karen claimed inspection authority that didn't exist. Someone else posted a photo of her standing inside their fenced yard. The fear started turning into anger. 2 days later, I got a call from a detective. He asked if I was willing to make a formal statement beyond the initial report. I said yes. He told me the documents from my cellar had triggered a much larger investigation. Developers had already been contacted, permits were being reviewed, survey records were being pulled. Karen wasn't answering calls anymore. That's when the letters arrived. Certified mail, HOA legal notices, not to fine me, not to threaten me, to ask me not to destroy or alter any records related to property boundaries. I laughed when I read it. Too late. A few nights later, I heard footsteps near my fence. I turned on my porch light and saw someone freeze, then retreat back into the dark. I installed cameras the next day. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. The detective called again at the end of the week. He told me Karen had hired a lawyer. He told me she was claiming she'd acted on bad advice and that the board had pressured her. The detective didn't sound convinced. He asked me if I'd be willing to testify if it came to that. I said yes. That night I sat on my porch watching the sun drop behind the trees. The cellar door was closed, locked, reinforced. It felt solid again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was trying to figure out how much damage had already been done. Because when power like Karen's starts slipping, it doesn't disappear quietly. It fights. And 2 days later, the HOA announced an emergency meeting. Mandatory attendance. The email said it was to address recent misunderstandings and restore confidence in leadership. I read it twice. Karen's name wasn't mentioned once. That's when I knew Part 6 wasn't the end of this story. It was the calm before the public fallout. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday night. That alone told me it wasn't about transparency. It was about speed, about getting people in and out before they had time to think too much. The community center parking lot was already full when I arrived. Cars lined the street. People stood in small clusters, whispering, checking their phones, looking toward the entrance like something might explode out of it. Inside, the room felt tense. Folding chairs packed close together, board members sat at the front table, stiff and silent. Corinne's chair was empty. That didn't last. She walked in 5 minutes late. No apology, no hesitation. She wore the same confident smile she always did, like she was daring the room to challenge her. For a moment it worked. The noise dropped. People went quiet. Corinne started talking immediately. She said there had been rumors. She said there had been misunderstandings. She said personal grievances were being blown out of proportion by people who didn't understand how HOAs worked. She never said my name. Then she said something that made the room shift. She said the police incident had been resolved. That's when I stood up. I hadn't planned a speech. I hadn't rehearsed anything, but when I spoke, my voice didn't shake. I told them the police investigation was ongoing. I told them evidence had been collected. I told them Corinne had been caught inside my locked root cellar without permission, using tools with another board member. Corinne laughed, loud, sharp. She said I was exaggerating again. That's when the detective walked in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't announce himself dramatically. He simply introduced himself and said he was there because several homeowners had requested clarity. The room erupted. People started talking over each other, shouting questions, accusations. Corinne tried to regain control, pounding her hand on the table, but no one listened anymore. The detective asked Corinne to sit down. She didn't. So he asked again. This time she did. One by one, homeowners stood up and shared their stories. Backyards entered without permission. Sheds opened. Garages inspected. Threats of fines that never had legal backing. Each story chipped away at the image Corinne had built. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Some looked genuinely shocked. Others looked like they were doing math in their heads, calculating liability. The detective explained that the investigation wasn't limited to trespassing. That property boundary manipulation was being reviewed. That documents had been recovered showing potential misrepresentation of land ownership. Corinne stood up again, shaking now. She said she'd acted in the community's best interest. She said difficult decisions had to be made. Someone in the back asked why she needed bolt cutters to make those decisions. The room went silent. Corinne looked around like she was seeing the faces for the first time. Not supporters, witnesses. A board member cleared his throat and announced a vote of no confidence. Corinne tried to object. She was cut off. Hands went up. More than half the room. Corinne's authority vanished in seconds. She left without speaking, pushing past chairs, face red, jaw clenched. No one stopped her. The detective stayed behind, answering questions, collecting statements. I watched neighbors exchange looks that said the same thing. This wasn't over. As I walked out into the night, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It said I should be careful, that people didn't like troublemakers. I stared at the screen for a long time before locking my phone and putting it away. Because I knew Part 8 wouldn't be about meetings or votes. It would be about consequences. The morning after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt different, quiet in a way that didn't feel ominous this time. It felt relieved. People waved as they passed, cautious but curious. They had seen Corinne's power crumble, and they were watching to see what would happen next. I stayed in my house most of the morning, staring at the root cellar door. Locked, reinforced, secure. It had been through a lot, but it stood solid like a monument to persistence and boundaries, both physical and legal. By mid-morning, the phone rang. It was the detective. Corinne had been served with official charges: trespassing, misuse of HOA authority, and attempted tampering with property records. He explained that she was now under investigation for falsifying documents and trying to manipulate property boundaries for personal gain. I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Relief that the law had finally caught up, and disbelief at the audacity it had taken for this to get this far. For years, she had acted as if she were untouchable. And now, the person who had terrified a whole community was facing real consequences. I walked outside to check the cameras I had installed. Footage showed Karen storming off from my house after the police arrived, flustered and panicked. Every movement documented, every word recorded. It was almost poetic justice. The woman who had spent months intimidating neighbors now couldn't intimidate a single soul, and every attempt at manipulation had been captured for evidence. Later that afternoon, I got a notice from the HOA board. Karen had been officially removed from her position as president. An interim board was put in place. New rules were being drafted to ensure no single person could wield that kind of unchecked authority again. And for the first time in years, homeowners felt a sense of security. I checked on my cellar again. Everything was exactly where it belonged. Crates returned to corners, papers stacked neatly, dust brushed away. I sat on the steps for a long time, running my fingers along the worn wood of the door handle, thinking about what had happened. The fear, the tension, the sleepless nights. Then, without warning, my neighbor came over. She was smiling, holding a plate of cookies. She said, "We've all been watching. You did the right thing." It was a simple gesture, but it meant more than anything. I realized that standing up for myself hadn't just protected my property. It had protected the entire neighborhood from someone who thought rules didn't apply to her. Weeks passed. Karen's lawyer tried to argue in court that her actions were good faith, attempts to enforce community rules, but the evidence was overwhelming. Statements from neighbors, footage from my cameras, the documents she had tried to seize, all of it painted a clear picture. She wasn't enforcing rules, she was rewriting them for her own gain. The day of her first court appearance, I watched from a distance as she arrived, dressed sharply but visibly shaken. The judge read the charges, and Karen's face turned pale. I had no sympathy, not for the person who had tried to terrorize me, my neighbors, and my property. By the end of the week, Karen had been fined, ordered to pay restitution, and permanently barred from entering anyone's property without express permission. The HOA board was required to publicly acknowledge her misconduct and apologize to all affected homeowners. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the crickets and the wind in the trees. The neighborhood had finally settled into normalcy, but the lessons lingered. Boundaries mattered. Authority had limits. And courage, even in small forms, could change everything. I glanced at my cellar one last time. Its door was shut tight, secured against anyone who thought they could ignore the rules. But in my mind, it had become more than just a storage space. It was a symbol. A reminder that sometimes standing firm in what's yours is the only way to protect more than just your property. And as the lights went out across the neighborhood, I knew one thing with certainty. The fear was gone, Karen was powerless, and this story would be remembered, not for the chaos she caused, but for the quiet, unshakable strength that stopped her. The cellar door closed one final time, and with it, a chapter of intimidation, lies, and trespassing came to an end. I could finally rest, knowing that some battles, though scary and exhausting, were worth fighting to the very last second. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.